So now that Shadow of the Erdtree is out, and I finally played Sekiro, which was the last FromSoft Souls game I had yet to play, I think it's time for a generic ranking video. I mean, I'm not trying to base my channel on ranking stuff from the Souls games, like top 10 shit type items in the series. I got into these games in like 2020, and since then I've become a Souls-like addict, replaying them over and over and over and over again. Not non-FromSoft Souls games though, like, I want the real thing. But after replaying them over and over again for like 4 years now, I'm honestly ready for a bit of a break from these games. So I'm just going to give my general feelings and rank each game from worst to best. Yep, how original, if anyone gives a shit. And then say goodbye to the series for a while. Unless this video does really well somehow, and then I'll definitely leech off it and do more generic ranking videos. Anyway, number 7. At last place is the first entry of the series, and yeah, it is the weakest in my opinion. The game is still clearly good, of course, however it just doesn't hold up to the other entries. Yes, not even Dark Souls 2. Firstly, I've only played the remake. I know that a decent amount of people have a problem with some of the changes that were made in the remake, most notably to the model designs and art style, which to be honest, I can understand to an extent. It does look like a bit of a generic fantasy setting for the most part. Hopefully, not playing the original doesn't make this list invalid. Anyway, the gameplay, it is what it is. There's not too much to say about it. I mean, if you're watching this video, I'm assuming you know how all these games play. I don't have to explain it to you like you're a child. I know I made a joke about Demon Souls not holding up to even Dark Souls 2, but honestly, it actually does have better gameplay than Dark Souls 2 in my opinion. Because while Demon Souls and Dark Souls 2 share the same fundamental gameplay and combat, at least when I'm playing Demon Souls, it doesn't feel like I'm playing in zero gravity or stuck in a bath of thick mud. To be honest, I don't actually know if any of the jank was fixed in the remake. I feel like I heard that Bluepoint didn't actually change anything gameplay wise. If that is the case, I don't know how Dark Souls 2 managed to be worse gameplay wise than its previous 2 entries. Anyway, this isn't a Dark Souls 2 critique video, so let me stop bullying it. The areas for the most part I actually think are pretty good. Yes, the levels are extremely linear and the game follows a more mission type level design, unlike the later games in the series. But the actual levels themselves I mostly have positive feelings for, to be honest, especially the Boletaria Archstone. However, every time I complete 3, maybe 4 Archstones in a playthrough, I definitely start to feel a bit of tedium from the mission style level design. The bosses are overall the weakest in the series. It is true when people say the bosses for the most part are gimmicky. However, this isn't always a negative thing. I mean, for example, Storm King in the remake is my favourite boss in the game. Like, it's one of the most beautiful visual spectacles I've ever seen in the game to this day. But for every Storm King, we have a shitty gimmick boss like Dragon God or, I don't know, Adjudicator. Basically, gimmick bosses aren't automatically shit. Like, it is possible to make a good gimmick boss, contrary to belief. Not to say all bosses have a gimmick. Bosses like Flamelurker and King Alan exist, for example, which I'm a big fan of the latter, apart from his fucking occasional jankiness. And music is probably the weakest in the series, maybe apart from Sekiro, which I barely remember any music from that game. I'm gonna be honest though, people say the music from the remake is a big downgrade from the original. However, the tracks I have heard from the original, they sound extremely goofy. But yeah, Demon Souls is still a good game, it's just the weakest in the series in my opinion. 6th is the most hated game by the community, Dark Souls 2. The way people go on about this game, you think it smoked their entire family. To be honest though, if we are talking about gameplay, which I understand is the main focus of a game, usually, then I get it. Let's be real, the gameplay is arse. It's a clunky, slow slog with terrible hitboxes, made worse by the awful adaptability stat. I think the devs saw the feedback of Dark Souls 1 difficulty and tried too hard to make it a focal point of the game, resulting in it just being unfair in some parts. I actually do think it's the hardest entry in the series, but for the wrong reasons. So despite having blasphemous combat and gameplay, why isn't it last? Well, because I actually like the majority of everything else other than the gameplay. The areas overall, I actually like. Level design definitely isn't the labyrinth like Dark Souls 1 is, but the quality and atmosphere of the areas are apparent. I also enjoy the world of Dark Souls 2 in general. That means the lore as well, which I generally think is one of the better lore stories in the series. I think the main problem with the areas is the enemy placement, which also ties back to the gameplay, because a lot of areas just throw multiple enemies at you, and if you have played Dark Souls 2, you know the torture of dealing with more than one enemy at once. Prime example being in the old Iron Keep. Fucking hell. It's appropriate that this area looks like hell, because going through this area is my idea of it. The level design in the DLC, however, is clearly an improvement from the base game. Shulver, Broom Tower, Elysium Lois are all top tier areas for me. Only a few base game areas can hold up to them, such as Dragon Lake Castle maybe. The DLC improves on the bosses as well. Fume Knight, Sin, and especially the Burnt Ivory King, who for me is the only S tier boss in the game. Yeah, So Alone is good, but come on man, he's extremely overrated. I feel like if he wasn't wearing samurai inspired armor, he would not be held in such high regard. It's fucking weebs, man. However, the bosses in general are bland for the most part. I mean, it doesn't help that the standard enemies in the entries after this game make Dark Souls 2 bosses look like tutorial enemies. As for the music in the game, I don't really know what to say about it. I only memorized like 3 songs from the game, including the DLC. I'll say the OSTs from Demon Souls, Dark Souls 2 and Sekiro are overall pretty forgettable. I touched on it before, but I enjoy the story and lore of Dark Souls 2 more than 3, but not as much as 1. Dark Souls 3 obviously feels like more of a proper sequel to Dark Souls 1, but Dark Souls 2 feels like a good spin-off story set in the Dark Souls universe. I enjoyed Drowned Lake as a setting as well, and the story of Vendrick and Aldia is interesting. So yeah, overall Dark Souls 2 definitely does have the most problems and flaws in the series, but it still has enough going for it to be above Demon Souls. However, the next game on the list I genuinely think almost has as much flaws as Dark Souls 2. So out of all the games on this list, I actually think I have the most to say about Dark Souls 3. I'm going to say this, I genuinely think the bosses saved this game. I think it's a popular opinion in general that Dark Souls 3 has one of the highest boss qualities in the series. However, for example, another game like Sekiro with a very strong boss roster is way more than just its boss roster. Dark Souls 3's bosses hold the game up to a massive degree. I'll tell you what I mean. If you don't like it, go cry about it. Okay, so for me, Dark Souls 3 probably has the weakest areas, level design, atmosphere, and maybe even lore as well in the series. So starting with the areas and level design, yes, the areas are very linear with not a lot of branching paths, but honestly, that isn't even my main problem with them. A linear area does not mean bad, as I said with the Demon Souls ranking. I think a lot of areas just aren't very interesting in general, especially the first half of the game. It's like when people regurgitate that the second half of Dark Souls 1 is terrible. Well, I feel the same way about the first half of Dark Souls 3. All but a few areas are bland, boring, tedious, and have a non-existent atmosphere. The game's just grey and dead for the most part. It's funny because even though Dark Souls 3 does have arguably the best bosses in the series, I still think, just like the areas, the majority of the bosses in the first half of the game actually aren't that good, which people seem to gloss over. Now, as for the second half, the game clearly increases in quality from the areas to the bosses. I'd say when you get to Irithyll is when the game starts to turn around for me. The areas are still linear, but just more interesting and more fun, just a better quality. And some don't look like death like the first half of the game. Even then, there's still not a lot of areas I'd consider in high regard, relative to putting them up against the other areas in the series. I think Lothric Castle is probably the best area in the game. The bosses in the second half, I pretty much enjoy most of them. The Twin Princes, Nameless King, Soul of Cinder, Champion Gundyr, Dragon Slayer Armor are all great. Even bosses like Aldrich and Osiris, bosses that most people don't have good feelings for, I like. And yeah, also the music is amazing, probably my favourite in the series. Unlike the previous 2 games on this list, it's infinitely more memorable. Made even more memorable with the DLC of Dark Souls 3. Ashes of Ariandel is good, but I'd probably say it's the weakest DLC in the series. If Sister Frida wasn't in that DLC, the DLC would be very forgettable for me. And it's just another example of the bosses holding up this game even in the DLC, because the Ring City is somewhat the same. Not to say the areas are weak in the Ring City, because they aren't, but when you hear people talk about the Ring City for its quality, they're overwhelmingly talking about the amazing bosses, and for good reason. Quick extremely hot take by the way, I don't really rate Gale to the extent that everyone else does. I mean, he's obviously a great boss. I just never really understood the shouts of him being the best boss of all time. Feel free to dislike the video. Also, the lore and the story of Dark Souls 3 just never really interested me. I was never a fan of the whole Lord of Cinder concept and returning them to their thrones. It just felt like another excuse to collect Lord Souls for the 3rd time. I don't mind the whole fan service of referencing Dark Souls 1 like every 2 seconds though. In fact, I think it's good harmless fan service. Overall, I still enjoy Dark Souls 3, I just value these games more than for its combat and bosses. If Dark Souls 2 didn't have horrific gameplay, it would have been above Dark Souls 3. Also, quick mentions to the PvP. I haven't played much PvP from these games, but Dark Souls 3, I have a lot of good memories from Dark Souls 3 PvP, so yeah. Sekiro was the final game I'd left to play out of all these games. It's my first series on YouTube. If you want to watch any of that shit, then go ahead. No one else did. Anyway, despite being the last to play, and despite me not playing it nearly as much as the rest, it still is one of my favourites. Yes, I know it's number 4, which is technically a midpoint placing. These remaining 4 games, I'd say I love, whereas the other 3 I've ranked, I'd say I like. Once I play Sekiro more, it could definitely go up by a place or 2. But yes, the aspect of Sekiro that clearly stands out to me the most, and pretty much everyone else in the world, is the combat and gameplay. Despite the combat essentially remaining the same throughout the entire game, with not necessarily any room for like build variety, it just doesn't really matter because it never gets old or boring. I haven't really mentioned difficulty when talking about these games, as it's not really a big factor overall for me, but I disagree with the overwhelming consensus that Sekiro is the most difficult game in the series. I don't know, the combat just clicked with me quite fast. I didn't really struggle until I fought that fat fiery shit, Demon of Hatred, who's a boss pulled straight out from Bloodborne and doesn't abide by the general fundamental combat mechanics of Sekiro. How people think Ishin is harder is beyond me. Not to brag or anything, but I one-shot him. Yeah, I actually found the decrepit dying sick old version of him harder. I'm not even fucking joking. Anyway, speaking of bosses, I find that the bosses are of a consistently high quality level. There's not really a boss I have any genuine dislike for. Yes, not even those disabled monkeys, or even the duo apes even. I think consistent is the perfect word to describe this game. From the gameplay, the bosses, to the areas. It has the least dips in quality, I feel, out of all of these games. However, for me, it just does not reach the quality overall of the remaining 3. Touching on a few other aspects of the game, I mentioned how the areas are consistently good or great. Most areas are fun, are interesting, are very versatile, and have a very strong atmosphere. I'd say the main dip in the game comes from where you defeat Genichiro at Ashina Castle, and you have to collect the Mortal Blade, what is it, a flower, is it like a fucking rock? I don't know, is it a rock? I don't know. Now, Senpu Temple is exempt from this critique, as I think it is an S tier area, but the other 2 areas, what are they? The No Scope Fort, the Monkey area, that Misty Forest, and that village, Mibu village, are pretty mid. That's the only noticeable dip in the game, and even then, it's not even that bad. And the story and the lore of the game is solid. It's nothing crazy. It's clearly meant to be a more straightforward, understandable story. Not everything FromSoft make has to fry your brain. Also, thinking about Sekiro's straightforward story makes me think about Armored Core 6. I mean, it's obviously not on this list, but I very much enjoyed that story and characters and the game overall. Just thought I'd give it a little mention, because that game is very good. Finally, the only negative I have about the game is the music. I can't really remember a lot of music from the game. I like Owl's themes. Both of his themes are good, and Ishin's theme is good. But apart from that, it's very forgettable. However, I like the introduction of ambient themes for areas, rather than just boss music. An aspect I'm glad they brought over to Elden Ring. So yeah, in summary, Sekiro is a game of consistent high quality and consistently forgettable music. But the remaining 3 just hit higher peaks overall. So I played these games in a really random order. My first was Bloodborne, then Demon's Souls, Dark Souls 3, Dark Souls 1, Dark Souls 2, blah blah blah. And I got into these games quite late. What I'm implying is, I have no nostalgia bias towards any of these games. Dark Souls 1 is just that good for me, despite it clearly not being as refined from a gameplay perspective than later entries. So what I said about Dark Souls 3 having great bosses and gameplay, Dark Souls 1 completely shows my point about these games being more than just that. The aspect when I think about Dark Souls 1 is firstly its atmosphere and overall feeling of the world. I think atmosphere in games is a very underlooked part of games, and Dark Souls 1 may just have the best atmosphere I have ever played in a game. It's a decrepit world, but not just a one-dimensional aesthetic such as Bloodborne, which every area feels and looks the same pretty much. It has varied environments throughout, with a different feeling and aura. God, the internet has made me hate that fucking word. Also, having these charming broken characters in this dead world adds to the feeling. Putting aside the atmosphere of the world, the areas and level design are masterfully done, apart from some areas. I know that's a popular opinion that the second half of Dark Souls 1 is a lot worse than the first. However, I do think it's a bit exaggerated. I mean, I do agree that the first half is better for sure, but the way people talk about the second half, you think it's complete worthless trash. So I actually want to go through the second half of Dark Souls 1, give my thoughts on it, because I actually don't think it's that bad. Okay, so the strongest part of the second half is Duke's Archives. For me, it's on the same quality as the areas from the first half. I enjoy its level design, for example the staircases, and the whole part where Seath canonically kills and imprisons you. New Londo Ruins is a mixed bag. The first half with the ghosts is a bit annoying, but once the water is drained, I think the remaining area is a short but sweet one, with a strong, creepy atmosphere. Demon Ruins and Lost Izalith I actually think is quite decent, apart from Bed of Chaos, but I mean I'm ranking the areas themselves, not the bosses. Also, I haven't played the original release of Dark Souls, so I wasn't blinded by the lava when I played. And Tomb of the Giants, yeah, I'll give you that one, like it's shit. So yeah, the second half is pretty good for me overall. So how about the first? I mean, there's not too much to say. Everyone knows how good it is. Despite it being the second entry after Demon Souls, I actually have overall good feelings when thinking about the bosses. Are they top tier quality when comparing them to the bosses from the latest entries? No, but I'd say overall they are good. Yeah, not you though. I'd say the DLC bosses were the start of FromSoft creating truly great bosses, but Dark Souls 2 proved that not to be the case. ONS is still my favourite boss in Dark Souls 1, even after the DLC, closely followed by Manus. Artorias is a bit overrated for me. To finish, Dark Souls 1 lore I enjoy very much. I think it's interesting and adds to what I said about the atmosphere earlier. To be honest, I don't think it's too complicated or anything, and it is engaging. Something I don't share the same sentiment as Dark Souls 3. I also think it has the best characters in the series. And finally, the music is solid, not unforgettable like 3 out of the 4 games I ranked before this. I enjoy quite a lot of the boss music, some sound a bit goofy. It's not on the level of Dark Souls 3, Bloodborne or Elden Ring, but it's still good. Also, a few times it does add ambient music for specific areas, and in those areas it works very well, and some of these tracks are some of the most memorable in the game. So yeah, I love Dark Souls 1, by far my favourite Dark Souls game, and almost came second, but it's beaten out by Bloodborne. Was my first Souls-like game, and up until Elden Ring it was my favourite. I don't think that's a nostalgic bias of it being my first game either. I do just think it is that good. I avoided these games for ages because I thought they were solely made to piss you off. And when I saw that Bloodborne came free if you had PlayStation Plus or whatever it was, it's actually time to see if my thoughts on this series was true. And at first, I thought I was right all along. I played for like 2 hours, got salty and quit. But even in those 2 hours, I already saw more appeal than just difficulty. The world and atmosphere were instantly intriguing, and also the trick weapons really stood out to me, just how cool they were. So yeah, I came back like a crack addict 2 hours later or something, and pretty much fell in love, not just with Bloodborne but the whole series. The big appeal of my first playthrough was simply overcoming and learning the bosses in particular. I'll be honest, my first playthrough I didn't massively appreciate everything else about the game, just the feeling of actually progressing the game. The combat and gameplay itself I very much enjoyed, especially the trick weapons, which are all extremely unique and fun. People like to say that the weapon variety in Bloodborne is scarce, but I don't really agree with that at all. I mean, each weapon is basically 2 in 1. It's way more fun than using Greatsword number 65. Overall, I'd say the combat is only second to Sekiro for me. Now, speaking of aspects of the game I appreciated more on future playthroughs. Firstly, just like Dark Souls 1, the game oozes with atmosphere, and it has a decent shout at being my favourite lore in the series, no matter how much it cooks my brain. I love cosmic horror, and I love when any game in general inserts aspects of it in their game. Bloodborne is no exception. The areas and level design are well done, mostly. It's not on the same level as Dark Souls 1, it has some interconnectivity, like Cathedral Ward. That area connects to multiple other areas, but overall it is quite linear, I'd say. However, this doesn't mean the areas are bad or anything. I mean, the only area I have a genuine dislike for is the Snake Forest place, I don't know what it's called. It drags on a lot and it gets a bit tedious. A common complaint is that most of the game's areas look the same, which is fair, but when the areas have the amount of atmosphere it does, I mean, it's hard to complain. The actual quality of the areas from a gameplay aspect and not an atmospheric perspective are positive, maybe a bit weaker than some of the other games. Like Dark Souls 1, I think the first half of the game, its areas and bosses, are a higher quality level than the second half. The bosses of the base game I feel are actually quite underrated. Everyone knows how good the DLC bosses are, but act like the base game's ones stink. Bosses such as Cleric Beast, Father Gascoigne, Vicar Amelia, Ebriatus, I don't know how you say her name, are all great. And bosses such as Bloodstarved Beast, Ligarius are very solid as well. And even unpopular bosses like Amygdala or like Moon Presence and Rum I like. And of course, my favourite boss in all of these games is Gehrman. Fuck this goofy nerd, fuck this old fart, Gehrman is the best. So yeah, anyway, I'd say Bloodborne has a very solid base boss roster. And of course, moving on from the base game, the DLC improves on everything about Bloodborne to a drastic extent. Even after Shadow of the Erdtree, I'd still say the Old Hunters is the best DLC I've ever played. Hunter's Nightmare is probably my favourite area in the series, with my favourite second boss in the series, Ludwig. Research Hall is an extremely well designed area with a great boss in Maria at the end of it, and Living Failures I guess. And Fishing Hamlet is great despite it being my least favourite area in the DLC. I love Orphan of course also. Add in new trick weapons and make even better music than the base game, and I think it's fair to say it's still the best DLC and elevates it to a different level. If the Old Hunters didn't exist, I'd very strongly consider putting Dark Souls 1 above Bloodborne. Also, finally, the music, yeah, it's great. But honestly, for me, maybe an unpopular opinion, it's not as good as Dark Souls 3 or Elden Ring. Speaking of Elden Ring, no, it's not recency bias. The game has been out for like 2.5 years now. Fucking hell. Now I can say, even before Shadows of the Erdtree came out, that Elden Ring is FromSoft's best game, or at least my personal favourite. On my first playthrough, I loved it, but I actually still slightly preferred Bloodborne for whatever reason. It was on my second playthrough, which I started right after the first, I realised how great Elden Ring is. Seeing the route and order I can do things in the game, while also realising the amount of builds I could try, was a big positive for me and a big factor on why it was number one. For example, in my first playthrough, I pretty much explored each region in order before moving on to the next, finally reaching the Altus Plateau, which was a beautiful moment. And on my second playthrough, I realised you could get to Liurnia straight away. I then met that hunchback snake woman who I didn't even see in Liurnia on my first playthrough, got a stupid pendant back from
Marika's tits
to be given an invitation to the Volcano Manor this early in the game. Then I went up to the ruins, only to be met by her and join the Volcano Manor already this early in the game. I give this example in particular just to show how drastically different every playthrough can be, which in turn showed me how replayable this game is. Which is funny because I always see the bizarre opinion that Elden Ring is FromSoft's least replayable game. I mean sure, it's an extremely long game, especially if you do everything in it, but no one is asking for you to go crawl through every single catacomb or cave in every playthrough. Just because the game is long and open world, it doesn't make it less replayable. As I said, every playthrough of Elden Ring can be way more varied and different than any other of FromSoft's games. Anyway, tangent over, let me get into more on why it is my favourite. The combat and gameplay is essentially Dark Souls 3, but improved. I'm not going to pretend like Elden Ring is necessarily unique from the Dark Souls series, like Sekiro or even Bloodborne is. I mean, it basically is open world Dark Souls, which I don't think is a bad thing by the way. Being open world and the Dark Souls 3 gameplay being expanded upon is enough for me. So I've always been a fan of open worlds, not any open world though. Like I don't play any of that Ubisoft trash anymore. And Red Dead Redemption 2 ruined open world games for me, not because it was bad, because of how great it was. It's my favourite game of all time. Thankfully, Elden Ring's open world was a success for me. A giant map but also not empty, mostly dense, with much to do, and a DLC map from a purely level design perspective maybe is an upgrade on the original map. Not really a fan of the whole area being hidden by an illusionary wall though. Every region I like, yes even the snowy areas, everyone has a very distinct atmosphere and feeling. As for the actual legacy dungeons, for me, I think overall they are my favourite levels and areas in the series. I'm not talking about discount dungeons like Caria Manor or something like that. They are decent, but I'm talking about the real areas like Stormvale Castle, Volcano Manor, and the best area in the series, Lane Delt. Also Shadowkeep from the DLC, that's a very good area. The legacy dungeons reflect the openness of the open world. What I mean is most being very large and very versatile. I'd say from an overall level design, Dark Souls 1 may have the edge, just with the expertly done interconnectivity, but speaking on the actual quality of the areas themselves, I think Elden Ring has the best. As for the bosses, the community seems to have a love-hate, conflict-ridden relationship with them. For me, I personally enjoy Elden Ring's boss roster, more than any other Souls game. I'd say Elden Ring or Dark Souls 3. Not to say Elden Ring doesn't have some arse bosses though, it definitely does. Mainly duo bosses. FromSoft, can we please make duo bosses great again? Thank you. Also, I'm not really talking about random wannabe bosses when I'm talking about this. I'm talking about remembrance bosses, which are stacked with S-tier bosses. Godric, Radahn, not you, Rykard, Morgott, Melania, Placidusax, Malekith, Godfrey, Radagon. Yes, Elden Beast is not my favourite or anything, but Radagon by himself is one of the best. Mesmer, Bale, Dancing Lion are all great to amazing bosses. I'm not gonna lie, I'm not hearing the complaints about difficulty from these bosses and how they are unfair. I think the only two cases of a boss being genuinely unfair is of course Melania's Waterfowl dance and Radahn having a bunch of BS like that triple slash. Apart from that, I have no complaints about boss design. I actually prefer that bosses are a bit more aggressive and have less openings. It feels more like an actual fight. Quickly speaking on the lore, Elden Ring is probably my favourite in the series, or Bloodborne, depends how I feel on the day. The main appeal of the lore for me on Elden Ring is that it's clearly inspired from a bunch of different ancient mythologies, which have always interested me. I've heard a lot of inspiration comes from Celtic mythology, which I know nothing about. Yes, not everything's inspired from Berserk, as a lot of people would want you to believe. People will see a twig in a FromSoft game and be like, is that a Berserk reference? Is that a Berserk reference? Anyway, yeah, so I like all the pantheon family tree aspects of the lore. There's also a sprinkle of cosmic elements, such as the outer gods and the fingers, which is always appreciated. Yeah, there's still a shitload of unanswered questions from the game, but I think the general story and lore of the world is quite easy to understand, and it was probably my favourite thing about the game in my first playthrough, learning about the world and also exploring it. Finally, the music of the game is amazing, and people seem to underappreciate this as well. I don't know how anyone can say the music is unforgettable when it has tracks such as Godric's, Forsax, Mohg's, Godfrey's, Radagon, Morgott, Melania, and a bunch from the DLC. Also, forget about just boss music. I think the ambient music is what tips Elden Ring's soundtrack over Dark Souls 3. I think Dark Souls 3 probably edges Elden Ring on boss music, maybe. But when ambient music, such as Lane Dells exists, then Elden Ring overall might win. So yeah, this was my video, my generic ranking video on Souls-like, Souls games, whatever the fuck you want to call them. The placement of the games on this list, to be honest, was not hard to figure out for me. Like, I wasn't sitting at my desk pulling my hair out, thinking, oh my god, is Bloodborne above Dark Souls 1? Is Elden Ring the best? No, it was pretty simple to be honest. The only contentious placement was Bloodborne above Dark Souls 1. I'd say I only slightly prefer Bloodborne to Dark Souls 1, but yeah. If anyone is watching this video, don't go cry in the comments. Actually, no, please do. It would be very funny, I'm not gonna lie. But yeah, that's it. Goodbye.